I moved it to my bed, tying the mop head on its handle to simulate hair, caking red lipstick around its mouth. Then, seeing it there, splayed out, silly intake port waiting and ready, I was forced to think that there has never before been a better pairing. Except maybe peanut butter, a dog, and me. Disclaimer: this video contains discussions of topics shown on screen now, and the books I mention in this video also have its fair share of triggering topics. I don't go into detail in this video, but I do want to say that viewer discretion is advised. Additionally, this video by no means is meant to kink shame the vacuum-loving community. Love is love, even if your love is a vacuum, I guess. Hello, I'm Leah Toro, and welcome back to my channel. This is the obligatory moment where I tell you to subscribe to see if I somehow manage to make stranger videos than this one. And like, because you should. And this is also where I explain to you how this video came to be. There really is no explanation that can undo the unholy things I'm about to unload upon you. And that sounded weird. There really is no explanation that can justify the information I'm about to regurgitate and tell you. But the loose justification I have is that I saw this TikTok a while back where a person said that a lot of media analysis content never really analyzed anything, and it was more so like a summary and explanation of events with a little bit of commentary thrown in. And my idea of analysis content was always English teachers explaining how a little girl adopting a dog or something can be symbolic of the falling of the Roman Empire, or something to that equally absurd extreme. And so I decided that I want to try and make some other insanely out-of-pocket, out-of-the-box analysis of something. I racked my brain for a while, trying to see how strange of connections I could make, till I remembered this story about a guy who fucks vacuum cleaners, because I used to listen to Mr. Creepypasta read this story on a loop because it was really strange. And then, Spotify threw this cover of a Cannibal Corpse song at my head, and I had a urethra moment, where I decided that sex with vacuums was actually an allegory for necrophilia. A realization that I will present in what is possibly my biggest hear me out video to date. So, Stupid Sexy Vacuum is a masterpiece of absurdist horror fiction. It's a creepypasta posted to the r/nosleep subreddit by user Edward the Crazy Man, in which we follow a young man who is completely and utterly taken by the aura of the most arousing of household appliances: the vacuum cleaner. He recognizes that to some degree this attraction isn't normal, but discouragement he gets from his mom does nothing to stop him from indulging in the unadulterated sin of vacuums when she leaves for work. Giving it a makeshift wig, lipstick, and surrounding it with scented candles to set the mood, only to find himself faced with the rage of the now sentient vacuum which chases him around the house, attacks him with knives, while scolding him for his behavior. Our narrator narrowly escapes, and upon his mother's return he attempts to relay the day's events there, but she very much doesn't believe him. Having been shunned from the one thing that he fixated on, the narrator pushes himself away and tries to integrate back into the society he spent years avoiding in the name of pursuing vacuums. All the while being haunted by the now dormant but still lingering rage of household vacuum cleaners. Stupid Sexy Vacuum is a really interesting story, period, and it's also a really interesting story when you look at it as an allegory for necrophilia, because primarily of the fact that it doesn't contain a dead body at all. An aspect which I feel only works to reinforce the absurdity and horrors of the concept as a whole, both in relation to corpses and vacuums. To understand the key bridge between the concepts, I have to explain a bit about human attraction to things that aren't right. This isn't a universal feeling, but it's generally noted that people are inherently uncomfortable around dead bodies, more often than not finding a sense of uncanniness in the appearance of the dead, even if the bodies aren't exactly damaged. Some people hypothesize that there's some kind of primal brain hardwiring that recognizes the dead as a sign of a potential threat, which explains the fear of dead bodies more than explains anything else, but what I really want to reference is the aversion. So the better theory is in reference to that feeling of being uncomfortably trapped in Uncanny Valley. The simple explanation is that people recognize the familiar as safe and the unfamiliar as unsafe. Corpses are familiar in the sense that, by all means, they can be registered as people. It's evident in the fact that they are vaguely people-shaped more often than not. But they lack the key components typically associated with being a proper human being. Like, their skin is wrong, it looks weird and waxy. the way that they move is also wrong because it lacks that weight that comes with having, working muscles. It's so close to being a proper person, but it's also so incredibly far because it lacks the essence of life that really lets us recognize other people as other people. So when we put that idea into the context of necrophilia, you have stories of people who for some odd reason wish to be close to and even intimate with these uncanny entities, these almost people. It's not just scary, but it's absurd, and it's that absurdity that Stupid Sexy Vacuum plays into, and what makes it such a good creepypasta. Okay, so this is going to sound crazy, but think about fucking a vacuum cleaner right now. Like, stick with me. Think about a vacuum. Any make, any model, just any vacuum cleaner. Try and make it sexy. You're probably thinking, firstly, that I am insane, and secondly, unless you added some human-style sexiness to this vacuum, it's just not going to be hot. It's literally just a vacuum cleaner. And that is the kind of disconnect that this story gives you, and where its comedy and absurdity and parallels to necrophilia come from. It's giving you something that your brain cannot see or fathom through the lens of our main character. You get that disconnect where you're seeing the object of affections as they are, and not through the same perverted view that our main character does. It's kind of like when everyone is really into a certain celebrity, but you just don't get the hype, so when people say things like, I need this guy carnally, you're kind of just left to stare like the only sober person in a party full of drunk people. With vacuums, it's completely different from the whole corpse scenario, because it's a fucking vacuum. It's so disconnected from the human experience and disjointed from all the things that by conventional means would make people see it as attractive. None of it has remnants of anything that would attract a person, but here this character is, jumping through hoops explaining how sexy and hot it is. You kind of can't rationalize it in the way that you would rationalize other motives. I'm not saying that you should have a rationalization for necrophilia, but when you see movies like Friday the 13th, where Jason's mom goes around killing camp counselors because it's the negligence of those counselors that got her son killed, your brain can kind of see the train of thought leading her to the conclusion that violence is the answer, because understandably, if you were in her shoes, you too would want to enact some kind of vengeance against people who've done you wrong. When you see something like necrophilia, you can't really see that natural progression, because in any world, there is very rarely any situation that says, okay, the next thing to do is touch a corpse inappropriately. We never get an introduction to how the narrator of Stupid Sexy Vacuum got into the habit of thinking vacuums are hot, and it's hard to imagine how we got there. I know some wise guy in the comments is going to write me like a 3-paragraph long headcanon telling me that he could just be off of his rocker, and when you're off the rocker, you can just do and say anything. But that doesn't sufficiently fill the mental gap present. What series of events can everyone universally agree would make this guy think vacuum cleaners are hotter than women? Or men. Why did I say it like that? And I feel like that question establishes our footing in the lakes of the entirety of this concept. The parallels between how attraction towards corpses and vacuums exist, which means I can move on to the next part, which I guess is tonal excellence. So, alongside just being gross and absurd, there's also this comical part of necrophilia. It's the kind of surrealist comedy where it's not funny that these guys are touching the non-living, but it's the fact that characters are able to treat it like it's a normal task that make you let out this exasperated laugh. It's kind of like when someone tells a joke and no one else is laughing, but they're kind of cracking themselves up, and for some reason they're shocked that you are also not laughing. When the main character of the necrophiliac, Lucien, goes on about the difficulties of obtaining corpses and how it's difficult getting them out in various weather conditions in the way someone would talk about running errands, it's bizarre. You kind of think to yourself, wow, they're talking about dead bodies. And then there's this extra level of what the fuckness when you're hit with the contrast that is Lucien talking about the pleasure he gets from these bodies, and then it's back to, oh yeah, this shit isn't like just a little bit weird, it's insane. I realize I've introduced that story without explaining what it is. So, The Necrophiliac is this French short, I say short, it's like 100 pages, story written by Gabriel Whitcop, which is the diary of this man named Lucien. So, Lucien by day is a wealthy owner of an antique shop living in France, and by night he is a grave robber who digs up bodies to take to his fifth floor apartment to get freaky. It is a disturbing read. I remember I tried reading it once in high school, but the opening of it was so jarring that I literally could not finish it. But the story is very much a kind of gross-out horror novel, but for some reason, like Stupid Sexy Vacuum, it is kind of funny, because our main character will be in situations where his friend is asking him about his sexuality, and it's like, oh, Lucien, so you're not into boys? I thought that, but of course I like boys, and even girls too. Not able to really say to him, I would love your eyes sunken in, your lips silenced, your sex frozen, if only you were dead. Unfortunately, you have the bad taste to be alive. Which is a series of words that are definitely compiled into a sentence. Like I said, the concept of being attracted to non-human things is absurd, and the best way to approach it, especially if one wants to show off the character of the narrator and their mental well-being, is to deepen the disconnect with humor. I feel like humor shows a bit about a person's views and moral standings. How they joke about certain things is a great way to express how the character views stuff like their actions or their situations or situations revolving around other people. It's also a way of telling us as readers that our main character has a fucking bird brain. So much of Stupid Sexy Vacuum is just us laughing at the main character. Not through, like, jokes he's making, but just because his situation is so fucking weird. It's funny that he thinks vacuums are fuckable because normal people don't think that. And it's funny hearing about how his life is apparently falling apart pre-events of this story, but he doesn't seem to care because he thinks vacuum cleaners are going to solve all of his problems. And in The Necrophiliac, it's kind of the same way, where we do get things that are, like, equivalents of jokes, but we are meant to laugh at shit like Lucien digging up a grave in the rain, bailing last minute, only to find out that the next day, another sicko snatched the body and, quote-unquote, reap the benefits of his hard work. It's treated as a Dratz moment, like a mild inconvenience to Lucien, and to us, the audience, it's funny because, first off, there's two freaks that are interested in the non-living in France, and secondly, this guy, it's... what? That's such an odd situation to be in. It's fucking weird. But additionally to that comedical aspect, we also have things like projection, which allows for the stories to have that good balance between creepy, absurd, and funny. Once again, going back to the Necrophiliac, our main character, Lucien, is really big on descriptions. He's a descriptive guy, unfortunately. And a lot of his descriptions are of corpses. He describes their skin as ivory, he massages them with perfumes, he compliments them on various anatomy, and assigns them personalities. It can only be described as a kind of flowery language, maybe poetic. Not to the point where we can forget that he is talking about a corpse, because, trust me, it is incredibly difficult to forget that he is talking about a corpse. But to the point where we can see that he is very clearly projecting his own ideas of beauty onto this body, as though it is a blank canvas that he's meant to decorate. The abstract idea of living beauty being cast upon a corpse is perpetuated in Stupid Sexy Vacuum. That's an insane sentence. That's an insane sentence. Okay. The main character, in Stupid Sexy Vacuum has this moment where he puts a mop on the vacuum's head to simulate hair. He gives it lipstick to give it some semblance of anatomy, which also tells me that he has created an equivalent of human anatomy in his head for this vacuum, because it has a mouth and such, which I think is great and implies lots of great things about how he's interacting with this vacuum. But it's surreal, and it's strange, and when you think about if this story was literally about necrophilia, this would be a very off-putting scene. This would be something that literally could have just been in the Necrophiliac. How he attempts to dress it up and give it some semblance of life without life itself is weird. But because it's a vacuum, you just can't even get what this guy is yapping about because it's more surreal than if he was just doing all of this to a corpse. Because again, we have drifted so far away from the human experience and the human ideas of attractiveness and attraction. Again, this is going to sound insane, but if you really try to rationalize the desecration of the non-living, the best quote-unquote conclusion you would come up with is that because it has human anatomy, you could probably see why a character would be kind of attracted to it, because at the end of the day, still has person parts. But for Stupid Sexy Vacuum, that's not enough, because you aren't meant to look at it and think, well, maybe, or come to any kind of rationalization. You're meant to be confused and put off by how out of left field this concept is. Like how any normal person would view necrophilia, like how any normal person would view necro, we view this vacuum. It just doesn't make sense and is also kind of disgusting. Not kind of, it is disgusting. Not on the same level, but they're both kind of gross. There is nothing alluring to be found in either. There's nothing attractive. The vacuum just works as an extreme to widen that gap between the narrator and ourselves, because it is taking away everything that we could kind of maybe break our necks in the stretch trying to justify. It's just very out there, which is a part of what makes necrophilic media so interesting. I say that like I've seen multiple pieces of necrophile media. I've only read The Necrophiliac and listened to that one cover of a Cannibal Corpse song, so we're gonna pretend I'm an expert on necrophilia. I've read a few medical articles, so I guess I kind of am, in terms of YouTube creator levels of ingenuine professionalism. A part of what makes necrophilic media so interesting is how it explores the disconnect between people and the dead. Seeing a character who finds solace in the coldness of a dead body as opposed to the warmth of a living one is just jarring, to say the least. And we as people are so uncomfortable and avoidant to the idea of death that seeing someone embrace it in such an intense and uncomfortable way, in the way that people like Lucian do at least, very alienating. There was a refusal to accept the body in one form, but suddenly excitement in approaching and embracing it in another. And also know that I recognize that death exists in different ways in various cultures and is approached differently. And not always with some kind of avoidance or fear, but I'm not really talking about cultural differences. I'm being super duper general because we're talking about a very specific way of embracing the dead. And I think it really adds to Stupid Sexy Vacuum as an allegory, because I know that the story is technically not about necrophilia, and I doubt that the author intended for it to be anything more than a silly story about a guy who thinks vacuums are kind of hot. But it really does fit the bill and manage to make the concept even more alien by semi-constantly trying to tell us that this vacuum has the worth and is more than or equivalent to that of a person. Additionally, what he finds attractive can reside in the inability of the vacuum to communicate because it's non-sentient, which funnily enough is actually a very common reason that people like corpses. But anyway, he's telling us the power button is titillating and that the random string in dust is hot because he wants to drag it through his teeth or something, which we know these things are not attractive, and we know these things are not hot, but it's not said to us in an attempt to make us understand. This is just how he's seeing things. We're forced to bear front seat and first-hand witness to this guy's insanity. It's kind of like the situation I mentioned earlier where everyone's finding this one guy hot and you just don't seem to get it, and so you're just staring at it with completely different and sobering viewpoints. I also want to say that there's this really interesting way that Stupid Sexy Vacuum goes about exploring the concept of like guilt and persecution. Well, guilt or maybe lack thereof, it kind of depends, through the fucking vacuum. So, in a lot of media adjacent to the necrophiliac, there is almost constantly a lack of remorse. To compare it to something else, I'd have to say something like Lolita, so let me explain that. In Lolita, the writing style the author uses when talking through the main character, you get this flowery kind of language when he's talking about himself. Well, because it's an autobiography of sorts written through his twisted and fucked up worldview, it also works as a running justification for his actions, and not really a way of expressing guilt or remorse. It's meant to perpetuate the idea of his innocence. He talks about how well he treated Dolores and how much he cared for her and how she was actually a very attractive girl or whatever the fuck. And it tells you that he's deeply fucked up in the brain department, but it also tells us that he feels that his actions weren't cruel, unjust, or abnormal in any way. It also tells us how he views Dolores and why he believes that his behavior isn't deserving of persecution. But then, in the necrophiliac, there is, no attempt at justification or self-defense. Through the entirety of the story, Lucian is living in I don't give a fuckistan. He has enrolled in the I don't give a fuck wars, and he has gotten the badge of honor. He knows that laws exist, both moral and legal, that say that you cannot do the things he does to the non-living, but he does not care about the moral aspect as much as a normal person would. His recognition of the law aspect of this is evident because he knows they exist. He understands that what he's doing is objectively and legally not right, but he doesn't take these sentiments to heart. He is driven by his desires, and that clouds his judgment as it motivates him to not subscribe to the ideology of the masses. His focuses are on doing what he wants and not being reported to the police in the process. In Lolita, the main guy has what I'm going to call normal view and freak view. Freak view is like the rose-tinted glasses. It's the flowery language and the borderline poems and his idealized view of himself and his victim. How Dolores is this perfect, angelic girl that no other girl could ever amount to, versus the moments where he's like, she is literally like a child and children are so gross and lack all of the mannerisms I, a grown man, find attractive because, they're kids. But in the necrophiliac, the entire time, he's like, okay, this is a corpse. You know it. I know it. Let's get freaky. There's never a moment of pure disgust or total reel back of the curtain to make the character confront the harsh reality of their actions from a moral standpoint. Like in the book's opening, so in the opening part of the book, the first diary entry that Lucian writes, the corpse gurgles and expels liquids, which is, I'm pretty sure, a kind of normal thing for them to do. And we don't get, this moment of pained realism where he sees the corpse as a corpse and not an object of affection. He's just like, oh, this corpse is very rude. It should have not thrown up on my floor. That was very gross of it. I expect better manners from the non-living guest in my house. And it doesn't stop being personified or idealized in its corpse state. Sure, in Stupid Sexy Vacuum, the vacuum stops being referred to as stupid and sexy because it's, throwing knives at him. But he has a kind of moment I hesitate to call sobering, and I could instead call it reeling disbelief, where he's just like, you're a vacuum, when the vacuum is telling him that he's fucked up in the head. Which to me is him going, you aren't a person to me, you're an object, a being meant to exist for me to project my sexual pleasures and desires onto. Much like in the necrophiliac with Lucian, where there's this dehumanization, I know it's a vacuum, and I know it was never a human to begin with, shut up, where they are stripped of their title and reduced to just being objectified, I know the vacuum is an object, don't say anything, whose entire existence is defined by their own perverted viewpoints. All that to say, Lucian provides no defense or justification for his action. He goes, it is what it is, and the narrator, in Stupid Sexy Vacuum, does the same thing. With Stupid Sexy Vacuum, there's a moment where the narrator is meant to apologize, but it's not sincere, methinks. It's more so an I'm sorry, I'm saying I'm sorry, please don't kill me thing, where there's no actual self-actualization, where they look inward and blame themselves for their problems. The main ops for these characters, the main ops in the eyes of these characters, characters like Lucian or the narrator in this story, is the police and the general public. They can't get caught indulging in whatever they're doing because they don't want to risk being persecuted socially or legally. And even then, that's more affecting them on the outside rather than their views of themselves and their actions. I'm saying all of this because in Stupid Sexy Vacuum, the main character is being chased by the vacuum and chastised, and a part of me feels like that can also be representative of him grappling with a kind of guilt or feeling of public persecution. I know that this is a creepypasta, and also the vacuum can talk and throw knives, so there is definitely some supernatural elements at play, and I'm not going to discredit them entirely and say that the narrator threw knives at himself and that the vacuum was never really alive because it was just a projection of his underlying feelings of self-hatred and disgust. I'm going to say that the vacuum was guilt incarnate, ? I'm kind of on the fence about this whole guilt thing the more I think about it, because honestly, the vacuum is more like the police ? Like, the vacuum to this story is how the police was to the narrator in the necrophiliac. With things like necrophilia, like not just in fiction but also in the real life cases of this, like where it's been studied, a big appeal of the non-sentient and non-living is their inability to judge and perceive. And when you consider that the narrator has been judged endlessly by his mom, and that his life prior to the events of this story have been less than ideal, with some, like, major turning points possibly placing blame in his direction, you can see that to some degree he would definitely start levitating towards beings that lack the ability to also cast that same kind of judgment on him. And even then, when he was being chastised by characters like his mom, and also how he knows he probably would be chastised by society, he ignored all of that because at the end of the day, the only thing he cared about was incapable of casting that same judgment. And then that one thing woke up and fucking judged him. That's fucking crazy. And then at the end of the necrophiliac, the police come to Lucien's door and tell him that he is a person of general interest. Like, he's sus and he kind of panics. He loses his composure as that bubble of invincibility that he was encased in pops, and he's just left to spiral and hope that they have nothing substantial on him, and the, like, many non-living bodies he has gotten freaky deaky with. And I think it's really cool seeing how persecution is handled in these medias, because it's not one for one, in the sense that it's not like a corpse came to life and began to chastise Lucien and attack him, but they both had their kind of safe spaces, quote-unquote, invaded, and had that wall of invincibility shattered by some outside force. One that they either didn't see coming, or one that they dreaded the inevitable interference of. I realize that this video is kind of insane in concept, but I do really think it's cool to see the conceptual parallels between Stupid Sexy Vacuum and works that the author has most definitely never even heard of. And I also want to try gearing my content more towards the very general land of media analysis. So this is just a little sneak peek of what you will be subjected to in the future. Also, I don't know if post-editing I'll keep this part in, but I feel like this video is going to be pretty shorter than the speed paint I have recorded for this video. So I made a second channel, and I'm posting the full speed paint up there, so you can also just watch that if you're really interested in seeing my line art and coloring process. The channel is Leah Undead. I'll be linking it in the description. I'll put something else on that channel as well. Who knows? If you like this video, subscribe and all of that good stuff, and I'll see you guys around. Oh look, I have an outro now. Yeah, bye.